All right, welcome to Vue 3, smaller, faster, and stronger. Today we're going to talk about some of the new and exciting features coming to Vue 3, and there's a lot to get to, so let's jump right in. First off, I need to give a little bit of a warning. At the time of this recording, Vue 3 has not been released yet. Some of these things that I talk about today could change, but I would be surprised if the things I'm talking about today changed given the status of the RFCs and kind of where we are in the release process. But I need to put that warning out there just in case. Before we look at Vue 3, I want to take a little journey through the history of Vue and kind of see how we got here, right? First off, Vue was created by Evan You, who worked at Google and was using Angular on a number of projects. He later summed up his thought process as, I figured, what if I could just extract the parts that I really liked about Angular and build something that was really lightweight? So the first source code commit to the project was dated July 2013, and Vue was released in February of 2014. And again, that was the first public release. So version 1.0 came in October of 2015, and that gave us improved template syntax, faster initial rendering, hot component reloading, thank you so much for that, and scoped CSS. The next year came version 2.0 in September of 2016, which gave us a whole bunch of performance improvements, a virtual DOM rewrite, or maybe even the first iteration of the virtual DOM, I can't remember, render functions, and server-side rendering. February of 2019, which again at the time of this recording is a little over a year ago, came version 2.6, which again gave us a lot of performance improvements, a new unified slot syntax, and dynamic directive arguments. So, which brings us to 3.0. And this is the biggest question that a lot of people are asking is, when is 3.0 going to come out? Well, we don't know that yet. We have heard maybe the end of Q1 of 2020. So I started thinking March is the end of Q1. March is the third month in the year. So Vue 3, third month, I see something going on here. There's also something in March that aligns with the green logo. So if I had to take a guess, I'm going to say, how about a St. Patrick's Day Vue 3 release party? How fun would that be? I found this image and I just had to. So I've done a little bit more digging and I heard some things come out of Vue Amsterdam. It sounds like at the end of Q1, we're going to have a beta version. I think we're on alpha version 7 now. So we might have a beta version, maybe on St. Patty's Day, I don't know. But it sounds more and more like Vue 3 is going to be released officially sometime in Q2 now. So a little bit of a bummer there, but there's a lot going into this and much rather get it right than rush release out for some arbitrary date. So just a little bit about when Vue 3 is coming. But again, the alphas are out now. You can take a look at them, download them, play around with them. But now that we know a little bit about the history, I think it's important to talk about how new features are added to the framework, because it is much different than how other frameworks add new features. And I'm specifically thinking of Angular and React. So React is driven by the needs and the goals of Facebook. Angular is driven by the needs and goals of Google, where Vue is driven really by the community and by the Google core team. So the Google core team may propose new features, but then the community really weighs in on it and drives kind of the direction of a feature. So one of the challenges of designing Vue, the Vue core team really tries to look at different use cases and provide a solution that is going to make everyone happy, because Vue really does have an extremely diverse audience of users. So we might have beginners who are just progressing from HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and are looking maybe for a first framework to jump into. You might have professionals moving on from jQuery. So they might have had these front-end applications that had a bunch of inner activity in them, or jQuery plugins that did something, and it's time to just move on from those plugins and kind of create their own interactivity within the application. So you might have someone who wants to just move on from jQuery. You might have veterans, developers who have migrated from another framework. Maybe they're using some home-rolled framework that they've used, or a React, or an Angular, or something else like Ember, Backbone, etc. You might have back-end engineers looking for a lightweight front-end solution. So I can speak to this heavily because I've been a Java developer most of my life, or at least a JVM developer. And I was looking for a solution that I could easily pick up. So Vue really kind of struck a nerve for me there. Great documentation, really easy to get started. I could just drop a script on a page if I wanted to. So that's another developer in this diverse audience. Finally, architects that are looking to choose the foundation which their entire organization runs on. So as you can see, this isn't just one person there, one group that they're developing or creating features for. It is a very diverse group. So to truly understand the needs of the users and help them, the users need to have a voice in the design process. As a community-driven project, it's important for the community to take part in shaping the future of Vue. And that's why the Vue core team adopted an open RFC, which stands for Request for Comments process. So if you can't see that link there, I will try and put that below, but that is basically a list of active RFCs, which we are looking at here. A little bit out of date, I think, at this point, but you get the idea. So if you go to Vue.js and /RFCs on GitHub, these are all the proposals, and inside of there is an active RFCs folder, and this is the group of features that are going into the next version of Vue, which is currently 3.0. So putting this presentation together, this is really what I had to go off of. And this was a unique challenge in itself. Usually when I'm putting some type of tutorial together or presentation, you have tons of books and presentations and articles to go off of. I really had these RFCs. So as I was looking at this, I needed to determine, like, can I even do this presentation? Do I have enough to go off of? And thankfully I did, because these RFCs are really amazing. They are well detailed, structured, and give a lot of information as to what the new feature is going to look like. And so here we're looking at a basic example. This is the composition API, and it starts with a summary and a basic example. And what I love about these RFCs is that they're really broken down into a template. So if you wanted to create your own RFC, you have to submit a pull request, and it has to follow this RFC template. And what I really like about this is you get a summary of what it's going to do, a basic example. And for me, the motivation is what really helps me understand why this feature is getting added to it. You can't just add features to add features. There needs to be some motivation behind this new feature. And I like that it goes into that. And not only that, but there's detailed design specs on why they chose a specific route, some drawbacks, alternatives, adoption strategy, etc. So if you're interested in finding out what's going into Vue 3, this is the best and first place to start, because, again, I really like the structure of all of these RFCs here in the RFCs repository. All right, so as I started putting this presentation together and looking at all the features that I really wanted to talk about, I noticed some goals for this release. And I don't know, this isn't the goals of the Vue core team. I don't think they've publicly said, hey, This is everything we want to accomplish outside of obviously things like performance improvements. But as I started to put these new features together, I really started to see three main areas of focus here. And that was making Vue 3 smaller, faster, and stronger. And so what I want to do is kind of dive into each of those today, and that's how we're going to talk about some of these new features. So when it comes to smaller, we're going to talk about the global API change, tree shaking, TypeScript, and something called Fragments. When it comes to faster, we're going to look at some virtual DOM updates and changes to the reactivity system. And finally, when it comes to stronger, we're going to talk about the composition API. So we're going to start with Vue 3 smaller, and we're going to start with the global API change. And this is really the first one I want to discuss because this is going to affect you whether you drop a script tag on a page or you use the CLI in the future to build out an application. You really need to understand this API because this is where Vue really starts. And this is a change from Vue.2 or Vue 2.x. So the global API that is globally mutating Vue's behaviors are now moved up to app instances created using the new create app method. And their effects are now scoped to that app instance only. Global APIs that do not mutate Vue's behaviors, such as nextTick, are now named exports. And so what does that mean? So in Vue 2, if you look in, say, your main.js, you may see something like this. Let's say we created a simple project using the Vue CLI. You may see some code that looks like this. Import Vue from Vue. So we're importing everything that Vue has to offer from Vue. Then we're saying, all right, import app from app.vue. That is the main component where everything kind of starts, the entry point to our application. From there, we're saying, hey, Vue, I want to configure some things. I want to configure ignored elements. I want you to use these plugins. I want you to set up some mixins for my application, create components, create directives, etc. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new instance of Vue. I'm going to render out my app.vue, and I'm going to mount that to a element with an ID of app. So as you can see, all those Vue.use mixin component, we are basically saying at a global level, these are the things I want you to do. And now I'm going to create one instance of my application. There are a couple problems with this. One, users need to carefully store original global configuration and restore it after each test. Some APIs like Vue.use and Vue mixin don't even have a way to revert their effects. And this makes tests involving plugins particularly tricky. So if you've ever used something like Vue test utils, it had to implement a special create local Vue method to deal with this. And so that is a problem that is going to be eliminated in Vue 3. Problem number 2 is that this also makes it difficult to share the same copy of Vue between multiple, now I'm air quoting here, apps on the same page, but with different global configurations. So let's say that you wanted to have one set of mixins for app 1 and another set of mixins for app 2. You can't really do that in this scenario because Vue.mixin is storing everything at the global level, and that's going to affect all app instances. So what the new global API looks like is it all starts with create app. And we'll talk about more about some of these methods that you're going to be importing and kind of how Vue 3 was restructured or rewritten from the ground up and actually created a much easier package structure to maneuver. We'll get into that as we go, but let's just start with this. So we import create app from Vue. I'm going to say const app is equal to create app. And this provides us an app instance. So this is our app context. The entire component tree mounted by the app instance share this same app context, which provides the configurations that were previously global in Vue 2.x. So now if we wanted to mount something, we can just say, all right, we have our app instance because it's equal to create app. Now I want you to go ahead and call mount, which is another API on there. And I want you to mount my app with an element of ID of app. So we saw what Vue 2 looked like before, and now what Vue 3 looks like afterwards. If we were to create something with the CLI and we were to look at our main.js, we would probably see something that looks like this. So we have our import create app from Vue. We have our import app just as we did before. But now what we're saying is, all right, const app equals create app. Now for this instance, these are the plugins I want to use. These are the mixins I want to declare. And then I want you to go ahead and mount this app. This can be particularly really enlightening if you just drop a script tag on a page and you create two kind of separate instances of a Vue application. You can kind of see this right away. So this is an important change, and as I said, no matter how you use Vue, this is going to affect you. So this is kind of the first thing that you need to understand with Vue 3 applications. So let's talk about global API tree shaking. The idea here is to make Vue's runtime tree shakeable by exposing as much of the APIs through named exports as possible. Vue is much, much smaller thanks to this approach. So what was the dilemma of Vue 2? As the Vue core team looked at the history, as we looked at the history of Vue earlier and how it continues to grow over the years, we have to think about some things. So as Vue's API is growing and growing and growing, the Vue core team is constantly trying to balance the trade-off between features and bundle size. They want to keep Vue's size overhead to a minimum, but they also don't want to limit the capability just because of that one size constraint. So with ES modules, modern bundlers, combined with minifiers, it can now eliminate a lot of the ES module exports that are not being used anywhere in the bundle. This meant that during the rewrite, they were able to restructure Vue's global, which we saw before, and internal APIs to take advantage of this so that users only pay for the features that they actually use. In addition, knowing that optional features aren't going to increase the bundle size for users not using them, the core team has much more room to include optional features in the core and in the future going forward. So what does this mean? So it means in Vue 3, we have to use our named imports only. And if we look at Vue 2, we import Vue from Vue, and then we can do whatever we want on the global API level, right? We can say Vue.nextTick, we can say Vue.observable, and those work. In Vue 3, we have to be very specific about what we're importing into our application. If we try to import just Vue and call nextTick on it, that is not going to work. You have to import nextTick and observable from Vue, and then you can go ahead and use those. So that is another big change that you're going to have to be aware of as you, mostly from a migration standpoint. If you're just writing new applications, you'll take advantage of this. But if you were to migrate an application, this is going to be very important. So in the CDN build, all these features are just going to be bundled in the bundle because there really is no way around that. But with ES modules and the modern bundlers combined with minifiers, we can now eliminate all those modules that are those exports that are not used anywhere in the bundler. What's really cool is even the compiler is going to generate tree shakeable code for you in your templates as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we get into how your templates kind of render or get compiled down to render functions. We'll see an example of that in a little bit. but just knowing that the compiler underneath the hood is generating tree shakeable code for you as well is really nice to know. So a lot of the features that you don't use, like keep alive or transition or vmodel or suspense, if you don't use them, they will not get imported. So what does this mean to us? This means that the new baseline is 10 KB gzipped, which is less than half of the current runtime. So right out of the box, not doing anything, you're just going to get a much smaller footprint as far as Vue goes. So something else I wanted to show, there's this tool out there called the Vue 3 Template Explorer. And I'm going to go ahead and run this. And as I run this, I'm going to talk about it. So you can get this. This is out on Netlify. You can see the URL there. You can also get this in the source code. If you download Vue Next, you can run it locally. But what's happening here is on the left, you're typing in some code that is basically what would be within your template block in a Vue single file component. And on the right is what it gets compiled down to. So if you don't know, your templates actually get compiled, your templates inside of your single file component get compiled down to something called a render function. And we'll see why that is a little bit later. But the code that it gets compiled down to, as you can see from the left to the right there, it is creating this tree shakeable code. It's not importing everything. It's only importing the things that it needs to import based on whatever you're using in your template. So that Template Explorer is really cool for a couple reasons. Just kind of reinforces that the compiler is writing tree shakeable code, but it also lets you like play around with render functions. If you've never written a render function and you want to see how that's happening, this is a great place to start. All right, so let's talk about TypeScript support in Vue 3. Are there any TypeScript fans out there? Who's raising their hand? I know I am. I'm raising my hand. I'm a big TypeScript fan. I used to use TypeScript all the time when I was writing Angular applications. To be honest, I haven't used it as much in Vue. I remember trying and running into some pain points. So I'm really hoping that in Vue 3, that story gets a lot better. So did you know that Vue 3 was completely rewritten from the ground up using TypeScript? Previously, all type definitions in Vue 2.x are using something called flow. And so I know the first question you're asking yourself is, are you telling me I need to learn TypeScript to use Vue 3, Dan? And of course, the answer is, Of course, the answer is no. You can continue to write apps using JavaScript. This doesn't affect non-TypeScript users at all. In fact, it's really going to help JavaScript users, and we'll see why in a minute. So if I don't need to learn TypeScript, why did they rewrite the entire Vue framework in TypeScript? Well, while the majority of Vue developers aren't working on the library itself, it's good to know that Vue 3 is going to bring a more maintainable source code base. Not only will it be using TypeScript, but many of the packages have been decoupled, making everything a lot more modular. Second, it provides better type definitions for those that are using TypeScript. In fact, those TypeScript definitions benefit JavaScript developers as well. So when you install Vue 3 when it comes out via NPM, it'll ship the type definitions with the Vue NPM package. And this is going to give us a lot. This is going to give us auto completion and type information in both TypeScript and JavaScript files. And it's even going to allow us to pull up inline documentation that were written as comments alongside those APIs. Finally, it's really going to give us some component code using TypeScript, and JavaScript will look largely the same. If you've seen a TypeScript component in Vue now, to what it may look like in JavaScript, they look vastly different. And that's because, again, you need to kind of do a bunch of things to make kind of TypeScript work in Vue these days. And I think that's going to kind of go away. And this is pretty exciting. So I'm excited to see this. This is one area of Vue 3 that I haven't jumped into yet. So I'm excited to see what this story looks like. And then I talked about decoupled packages. So the 3.0 code base has migrated to a monorepo format, which means they've split the internal into well-defined packages, each of which contains our own API contract and test suites. So if you're looking at the list there, Reactivity becomes standalone, which means if you wanted to, you could import and use it without the rest of Vue, which is really cool. So the runtime is also designed to be more modular. Runtime core contains everything that is platform agnostic. It does not assume the presence of Node API or the browser API. And then something like runtime DOM builds on top of core to make everything work in a browser. So I know the first time that I saw this, I was really excited because digging through Vue 2's source code was very confusing at times, and I didn't know where to find things. When I jump into this source code, I still may not understand everything, but I can at least kind of find things if I need to. So that's pretty cool to see. The next feature I want to talk about is fragments, or AKA multiple root nodes. So let's say that you were creating a page component in 2.x and you started out with a title. So we have a data function here that returns an object, and one of those properties is title. So that is some reactive data. We're displaying it in our template. We're using the v.html because that has some HTML in there. And this works just fine. Then you realize that you also wanted to add a description to it. I'm sure we've all kind of done something like this. I have a description now. I place that description element below my title. And if I go ahead and run this, what do you think would happen in 2.x? If you said you're going to get an error, then you would be correct. So the error that you're going to get is that a component template should contain exactly one root element. So an easy way to fix this in 2.x is you just end up wrapping everything in a container element. So here I have a div with a class of page, and now I have my two elements inside of there. Sometimes I won't even have a class because I just am using a div outside of there. So this is kind of annoying because it's not really, you're kind of placing wrapper components around elements when you don't need to. Maybe I'm not using that class of page. So this is just one of those kind of little annoying things that you had to fix or know about in 2.x. In 3.0, this is just going to work. We're not going to have to deal with it. You just have one, you can have more than one root node. So here I have both the title and description, or both elements can just live on their own, and this will just work. And if you remember from the template explorer, we had, if you go back and type in something like this, you will see that the compiler generates some code here, and it calls it a fragment. And so that's the name of this feature, aka multiple root nodes in Vue 3, is called fragments. And you will see the code that the compiler generates if you went ahead and typed in two elements right into the left side of that template explorer. So again, nothing groundbreaking, but I really appreciate some of these smaller features in Vue that just makes our day-to-day development a little bit easier. All right, so I want to talk about Vue 3 faster, and I want to talk about what's changing in the virtual DOM. But before I do so, I thought I'd jump into a little bit of a refresher for those who don't know what the virtual DOM is. So we've all heard of the DOM, basically an abstraction where all of these HTML tags become nodes in the DOM. And this is really our interface or our API to traverse and modify those nodes. It's a way to connect our HTML to our JavaScript. And so we have this HTML on the left. It gets turned into this document object model. We then display that in a browser, and then we have the ability, we now have this API to manipulate the page. So here in the script tag, I'm saying, hey, document, get me an element by the tag name of h1. Give me the first one, and I want you to change its text content to something different. And so again, it's just that API into the DOM that allows us to kind of change that. So we know what the DOM is. So what the heck is this virtual DOM thing? And a virtual DOM is really a way of representing the actual DOM in JavaScript objects. You often see this referred to as a virtual node or vnode for short. And what this is doing is it's comparing two snapshots of your view structure to figure out what's actually changed and what it should apply to the DOM. And so if it figures out this by comparing snapshots, it doesn't have to do a whole bunch of rewriting to the DOM, right? It can just figure out what's different, patch it all, and update the DOM at once. And in most cases, this is relatively cheap and fast. But there still is a cost. You have to walk the whole tree, no matter what, to see what's changed. And this really compounds as your application grows. And finally, you really need to understand that the virtual DOM is an abstraction of the DOM. So it is lightweight and detached from browser-specific implementation details. But since the DOM itself was already an abstraction, the virtual DOM is in fact an abstraction of an abstraction, which is mind-blowing. So the virtual DOM is just really, really fast, right? Well, no. The virtual DOM is usually fast enough. Virtual DOM isn't always about being super fast, and it's actually the reason we use it is because there's actually a trade-off. So why do we need virtual DOM? Remember, I said there was a trade-off. We're building an in-memory representation of the DOM in JavaScript. And that trade-off is render functions. So I mentioned this earlier when we started talking about that template explorer. But if you're not aware of this, when you create a template in a single file component, that template will get compiled down to something called a render function. So you get the power, the expressiveness of writing all of your markup in markup. You don't have to write your markup in JavaScript, which can be hard and confusing at times. The compiler is doing that for us. So the question then becomes, why is the compiler doing that? Why is it writing these render functions? When you are constrained to templates, there are certain things that you're just not going to be easy or available to do. Having the virtual DOM as that layer that you can drop into and utilize the full power of JavaScript is an important feature. So I've even heard Evan Yu refer to this once as having an escape. Sorry, let me start over. Having this escape hatch when you need that expressive extra power, which is really, really important. So now that we know a little bit about the virtual DOM, let's talk about what's changing. There are a bunch of performance improvements here, but I'm basically going to walk through one because at a high level, this is the one I understand the most. There are a bunch, as I said. Evan has a few talks online where if you really want to dig into this and understand what's changing in the virtual DOM, I would check those out because obviously he knows way more than I do about this, and there's some really interesting talks on what's changing in the DOM, so I would check those out. But I'm going to talk through one. So what are the bottlenecks of traditional virtual DOM? So Vue already addresses this at a higher problem or a higher level problem with virtual DOM performance by making sure that each component reactively tracks their own dependencies and only updates when needed. So across your application, when component A changes, it doesn't need to change, diff or change every component in your application. It only needs to do that at a component level. But inside each component, it's still a full virtual DOM diff using a traditional VDOM algorithm, which can be problematic. So let's take a look at one of those problems. So here in our template, we have a bunch of paragraph elements, most of which are static text, except that one in the middle is dynamic content, and it's a variable called message. So on the right is what the virtual DOM sees, right? Like it goes through and it has to diff the content, it has to diff the props, it has to diff the children, and diff each of the paragraph elements, diff the props of each paragraph, diff the children of paragraph, and repeat multiple times. And the reason for this is the performance of traditional virtual DOM is determined by the total size of the template rather than the amount of dynamic content in it. So we are looking at this with our two eyes, and we can plainly see there is only one dynamic node in there. Why can't we just diff that? Well, virtual DOM is just dumb when it comes to this. It doesn't understand that. So it ends up doing a full diff. So one of the improvements in Vue 3 is with the new strategy, update performance is only going to be determined by the amount of dynamic content instead of the total template size. So now if we have this template with 1,000 paragraph elements in it and only one is dynamic, it is only going to diff that one dynamic paragraph element, which is really awesome. So the Vue team did a bunch. I saw Evan show off a spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers in it in one of his presentations, but they basically took a V4 with 1,000 iterations, and inside each iteration, they had a bunch of elements with dynamic class bindings, text interpolation, a whole bunch of things going on inside of there. And we had to update all the dynamic bindings, taking an average of 100 runs. So they did that with Vue 2 versus Vue 3, and we saw 120 to 130 performance improvements over V2. Now, the best part about this is that we won't actually have to do anything except upgrade to see all of these improvements. So that's really great to hear. Next, I want to talk about the reactivity system, the heart of the framework. I think single file components in the reactivity system are what really pulled me into Vue, and probably the same for a lot of others. So what I want to do is take a look at reactivity, change detection, and a few caveats in Vue 2.x that are going to go away in 3. So here we have a template with an H1 element, and inside of there, we're displaying title, right? When we create a new Vue instance, we have a data function that returns an object, and inside of there, we have a property called title. Now that title is reactive because where we are declaring it, right? That is a reactive data property, which means if we were to go ahead and run this, we'd get what we expect. Title is now reactive, and if we wanted to, since we're assigning a variable here called VM for view model to our new Vue instance, we should be able to take that, pop over to the console, change the title, and it automatically updates in the browser. This is how reactivity works, and Vue makes this very easy. Again, it's because we declare it there. So this is the heart of Vue, is the reactivity system. And this works really, really well until it doesn't. And there are just a few cases where you kind of scratch your head and go, why doesn't this work as I expect it to work? And so Vue is going to walk through all of its properties and convert them over to getters and setters using object.defined property. This is an ES5 only and unshimmable feature, which is why Vue doesn't support IE 8 and below. So let's talk about reactive data. We declare some properties here in our return argument from our data function. So we declare A and B, and if we want to display those in our template, that's just going to work. Anything declared in the return object are reactive, and that's because, again, Vue is going to walk through those and convert them all over to getters and setters using object.defineProperty. What we can do then is change A if we want to. That's reactive. It will get updated in the template. Now, there's a case where this doesn't work. Now, let's say that we have defined A here in our return object, but in our created lifecycle hook, we declare a new property called B. If we were to run this, it would actually work the first time. It would display A and display B, but B is actually not a reactive property. So if we tried to change B, that wouldn't get updated in the DOM. And that's because it has not been declared in data, so it is not reactive. So one way that we can fix this is declare or initialize our B variable. So we'll initialize it here in our return object to an empty string. Then in the created lifecycle hook, we could go out and say call an API to get that updated information, and that will work. So knowing that, I want to talk about a few reactivity caveats in 2.x. So reactivity caveat number 1, adding and removing properties to an object. So Vue does not allow to dynamically add new root level reactive properties to an already created instance. However, it's possible to add reactive properties to a nested object using a special method that we're going to talk about. So as we can see here, we have a return object, and inside of that object, we have a book object with name, quantity, and price. And we're displaying all of those over in our template. In our computed property, we have a total, which is going to return the quantity times the price. If we were to run this application, everything would work just fine. But what if we took the price out of that book object and we moved it down to the created lifecycle hook? So this is the exact example that we saw with the AB. And this is going to work the first time, but then anytime price changes, one, it's not going to update in our template, and two, total, our computed property that relies on price, is not going to be updated either because that property is not reactive. So again, one solution is we could declare the price as 0, and then in our created method, go ahead and update it. This will fix it. We can also use something called Vue.set. There's also Vue.delete if you need to delete something. So back in our example, instead of initializing it and setting it in the created, we can just call Vue.set. We're saying the property that we want to change here is this.book. We want to add the property price to it, and the value is 12. And so this works just fine. Caveat number 2, modifying array indices. So let's say we had a book array. We have 3 books there, and we're displaying them over on the left. And when I call the add book method, so when I click a button, I'm going to add a new book. We go ahead and push a new book, this.newBook, which is whatever the value of the input element is. We're just going to push that new book onto the array and then clear that out. So this is going to work just fine. But now what happens if we wanted to update using an array indice? So we have our list of books again. When we click update book though, it's going to call a method and say, I want to overwrite the 0 element, so the first element in that array, and I want to change that to new release. And so this isn't going to work. And you're probably asking yourself, well, why doesn't this work? Why Why can we do what we did before, and why can't we do this? Didn't you just use array.push and everything worked fine? Why does that work, and why does this not work? And so if you dig into the documentation for Vue, you'll find that Vue wraps an observed array's mutation methods so that they will also trigger Vue updates. The methods that it wraps are things like push, pop, shift, unshift, etc. So when we call the array.push, Vue knew underneath the hood, hey, I'm changing something in this array. I need to go ahead and basically call those getters and setters, right? What it can't wrap, what it doesn't wrap, are things like array of index I is equal to some value, or array.length is equal to some new value. So Vue just never knows that something is changing when you change those, when you use the mutation methods on the right. So how do we fix this in Vue 2? Well, again, we can just come back and instead of accessing it using that method, like the array indice, we can call Vue.set. The property is, or the object is this.books. The index is 0 and the new value is new release. And so this will work. So Vue 3 is going to adapt a new proxy-based observation mechanism for detection and observation to changes within a Vue instance. Since the proxy-based observations aren't compatible and can't be transpiled for IE11, a separate build is going to be available for developers using that need to target IE11. And this particular build will continue to use Vue 2.x's object.define API, which would result in having the same caveats that we talked about. But if you don't need to target IE11, you're going to be moving to a proxy-based change detection. You won't have to do anything here. You'll get 100% faster, 100%, and half the memory size, which is really awesome. And what that means is we can say goodbye to these reactivity caveats. We can go ahead and set an array item by index if we want to. We can add a new property to an object if we want to. We can delete a property from an object if we want to. So again, just the way that the reactivity system is changing in Vue 3 kind of helps us get rid of these caveats. And if you've ever ran across one of these, you know that they can be a real head scratcher. All right, so now let's take a look at Vue 3 Stronger. Probably the biggest feature in Vue 3 is the composition API. I think one of the biggest questions developers had when this was introduced was why? Why are you introducing another way of doing things? So I'm going to talk through some of the problems that the options API presents and how the composition API can solve them. The first thing that you need to know is that the composition API is purely additive and can be used alongside the options API. This is an alternative, I'm going to say that again, alternative advanced API that solves some of the limitations with the existing options API. So please don't be this guy who went out and rewrote his entire application using the composition API after seeing a conference talk or after seeing a tutorial here on YouTube. There's no need to do that. You can certainly walk away from this and think about a component that you may want to rewrite, but no need to rewrite entire applications. So Vue is options-based. And what does this mean? And this means that when you create a new instance of Vue, the argument passed into it is an object of options. So I didn't know this actually had a name, but this is called the options API. So here we're looking at a new Vue instance, and it contains data, methods, computed property. You'll see a similar options API inside of your single file components. And it's not just limited to that. You could have things like components, props, data, computed properties, methods, lifecycle hooks, and more. Now the options API is great. It's intuitive, it's easy to get started with, but it does present a couple of problems. As components start to grow and they contain multiple features, it becomes harder to maintain. And we'll see an example of this in a minute. And as your components start to grow in complexity, you might start to duplicate logic in them. There are ways to reuse functionality in components, but each of them today do have their drawbacks. And a common feature request from developers working on very large projects in Vue is better TypeScript support. So those are three of the main limitations that the composition API set out to fix. So let's start by taking a look at the code organization issues in a Vue 2 application. You won't see this in smaller components, but as they start to grow, as your code base gets larger and larger, they become a little bit less readable and maintainable. And more maintainable code bases help everyone out, especially when you're bringing on new developers to a team. In the current API, we split up our code by options. In the composition API, we can split them up by feature. And so what does that mean? So this is going to be really hard to read unless you squint in and take a look at it, but don't worry about that. You don't really need to see everything that's going on in here. But what I have is a simple example of a component that will call out to an API and get a list of breweries by a city. It does that, it gets a list of them, and then has ways to sort them. So there are a couple different features going on in here, right? One, we're reaching out to an API for some data. Two, we're asking the component to figure out how to sort them. So everything highlighted here in purple is a feature that interacts with the brewery API. Everything highlighted in orange deals with some sorting of the results. As you can see, even in a smaller component, all of our features are kind of mixed up in all the different options that are going on here, right? It's hard to just find one feature in a small component. As a component grows in complexity, this becomes compounded. So on the left, we have the options API, and on the right, we have the composition API. As you can see, everything on the left is done by options, where on the right is each of those color codes are features. So if we wanted to work on one specific feature, you can see that that might be a lot easier to do in the composition API. Another common limitation with the options API is when you need to share logic between components. So we have the ability to reuse logic across components in Vue 2 using mixins, higher order components, and renderless components. Each of them come with their drawbacks, though, when compared to the composition API. I'm not going to go into each of these, but if you want to go ahead and search for them, or if you've tried to use something like mixins, you know what those limitations are. So those are kind of the two things that I want to cover today from both a code organization standpoint and a logic reuse. And so now what I think we should do is just kind of dive in and take a look at this composition API. So there's a link here. I'll put that in the description below as well, using the composition API. And you can both find the RFC there and the API reference. And the API reference is really great because this is how you can start to learn how to use the composition API. If you, if you see that on the left, you'll see like there's a setup method, there's reactive, ref. Each of these are kind of the building blocks of building our composition API. Now, if you start searching through the code base, you're not going to find a package called composition API. This is really just a direct result of more modular decoupled code base. If you remember earlier when we saw that graphic of the decoupled packages, I told you that the reactivity system being an independent package, right? A lot of the APIs you're looking at here come from that package. So the entry point to our application is the setup function. So this serves as our first kind of entry point into the composition API, and it's how we can use it in our components. So what you're doing here, again, remember anything that you want to use, you have to import. So as we start to use these different features, you're going to import those from Vue. So we start with our setup function. Now, it's important to note that when this is going to get fired, As far as timing goes, setup is called right after the initial props resolution when a component instance is created. Lifecycle-wise, it is called before the before create hook. Any logic that you would have normally done in say a created function, like fetching data from an API, you would do right here in the setup method. There is no created lifecycle hook in the composition API. You would do that here in the setup method. So just like we do in a Vue 2 application, we have a particular way that we need to define reactive state, right? We can't just declare it anywhere. We actually declare in Vue 2, we declare it in a data function in the return object. So you can't just declare a property here and expect it to be reactive. You need to use something like ref or reactive. Now, there are two functions that you can basically import from Vue to create a reactive property. You can use ref or reactive. And the one question I kept getting over and over is what's the difference between the two? So I actually have an article or a video on this. I think I have an article too. I actually have a video on this that goes into detail when you might want to use one or the other. So I'll go ahead and link below, but you do need to understand the differences between the two and when you might choose one or the other. So you're creating some reactive state here. You can also just write your functions within the setup function. So any normal function that you might have put in the methods block before, you can create here. You also have lifecycle hooks. So if you want to import those, you can use those just as you did before. So here I have the on before mount, on mounted, and on updated. You have lifecycle hooks. Again, you need to import those. There's also a watch function. So I would dig into the documentation, but the watch function is really nice because it allows you to watch reactive properties. So anytime count.value here changes, this watch function would get run again. And this is really a great way to maybe call an API if, say, a particular value change that would then need to trigger an API call, right? So I can show you more examples of that in the future, but that's a really handy function in the setup function. So as far as usage within templates, we need to return anything that we're going to use in a template. So that includes variables and functions. If the setup returns an object, the properties on that object will be merged onto the render context for the component's template. So those are important things to note. And if you're wondering, again, why you have to call state.count and state.double, please check out my article and video on ref versus reactive, and that will clear a lot of this up. So for me, the real power of the API comes into play when we start building a component, and a feature of that component was to track the mouse position on a web page, and we want to display the X and Y coordinates. We quickly realized that this is logic that we could use in other components. Remember, this logic is not an entire component we need to reuse. This is just kind of business logic. And so I'm going to play this. As you see, when my mouse moves, we kind of change the X and Y coordinates, right? So now what we can do in Vue 3 is I'm going to use a convention that you'll see out there, but I'm going to create a new file called useMousePosition.js. So this is a JavaScript file. I'm going to declare two reactive properties in there using the ref method. So X and Y are both reactive. I'm going to import an on-mounted and on-unmounted lifecycle hooks so that I can add some event listeners. I'm going to return the X and Y coordinates. And now what I can do is back in my component in the composition API. So here we are in our setup function. I'm importing that use mouse position. And now I'm able to use that in my composition function, or in my setup function in my composition API. So the logic reuse is a big important detail of the composition API. So these sound great, but when should I use the composition API if I shouldn't go rewrite my entire application in it? So first, when you need to organize large components by feature, this is probably a good option. when you need to reuse code across other components, like that logic that we just talked about, when you want better TypeScript support, or maybe just have a larger team that prefers this API. So today, what we talked about, smaller, faster, and stronger. We talked about in the smaller, the global API change, the tree shaking capabilities of the compiler, TypeScript rewrite from the ground up, and fragments. When it comes to being faster, the virtual DOM updates and the changes to the reactivity system, and Vue 3 being big, strong with the composition API. Now, there are a whole lot of other features in Vue 3, things like portals and suspense, simpler render functions, optional props declarations, functional components, changes to vModel, and so much more. So what I would suggest is going through the RFCs that we pointed to earlier and really reading through those to get a good idea of what is coming. If you're interested in learning more about the Vue 3, I have a course coming out that I'm working on. Head over to danvega.dev/courses/Vue3, sign up, and I will send you some information when I have it. So with that, I think I'm going to leave. If you have any questions about this presentation or Vue 3 in general, please leave them below. So I think I'll leave this with, I always like to leave this with a question of the day. What is your favorite feature coming in Vue 3? Mine is definitely the composition API, but I'm going to leave a comment below. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And as always, if you did find value in this, please go ahead and leave me a thumbs up, smash that subscribe button. And as always, friends, happy coding.